Welcome back to the Responsible Raw Materials podcast, where we explore the people, ideas, and actions shaping a more responsible future for our natural resources. Hardly a day goes by without the Middle East making the headlines in some way. Whether it's conflict, energy security, or global trade, it's a region that continues to shape many of the conversations around natural resources and the supply chains into which they flow. But how much do we really understand about what's happening beneath those headlines? For this episode, I'm joined by the brilliant Michael Barron, a geopolitical risk specialist and author of the Gaza Marine Story, which provides a fascinating account of the untapped gas field lying just off the coast of Gaza, which, more than 2 decades after its discovery, has still not been developed. Michael uses that story as a starting point for a much wider discussion about geopolitics, natural resources, and risk. We explore Gaza, Iran, and the Strait of Hormuz, the role of gas not only as an energy source but as a feedstock for fertilizers, and the changing significance of a Middle East that has historically been associated with oil and gas, but which also contains substantial mineral and metal resources. Iran is a particularly interesting example. It has significant mineral potential, a large and well-educated population, considerable engineering capability, and a strategically important location between Europe and Asia. And yet, as Michael explains, geopolitics can fundamentally change the accessibility and attractiveness of those resources. We also talk about what all of this means for organisations trying to make long-term decisions in places where the political environment can appear to change incredibly quickly. And I think this is where Michael makes a particularly useful distinction. Political events can happen quickly, but the political, economic, demographic, and social trends that lead to them can develop over many years. So, good geopolitical risk management isn't necessarily about predicting what will happen next. It's about recognizing those longer term trends, considering where they might lead, and reducing the chance of being completely surprised when circumstances change. Or perhaps, more simply, looking for the trends before they become headlines. We talk about how you do that in practice, why scenario thinking matters, why organisations need to be prepared to think the unthinkable, and why understanding the wider context surrounding a natural resource can be every bit as important as understanding the resource itself. It's a very timely discussion, but also one with lessons that go well beyond the Middle East. I hope you enjoy it. So I'm sitting in our Westminster office in a very hot and slightly steamy London with Michael. Michael, thank you so much for coming in today.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me, Sarah.
Now, Michael, we met a number of years ago, really talking about different types of risk, more on the geopolitical side. But I guess what made us find our way to one another was actually raw materials and some of those initial products that the world, or many of the people in the world, need. But before we go there, would you like to introduce yourself? So who are you and what makes you tick?
Okay, my name is Michael Barron. I live in this country, in the UK. By background, I'm a Middle East political risk specialist. I studied Arabic and I worked for consultancy before going into the oil and gas industry. So I come at the kind of raw materials from a kind of energy and gas perspective, because gas is not just a source of energy, it can also be turned into other things. And possibly more pertinent for this conversation on what's going on at the moment in the Middle East, I am the author of a book called The Gaza Marine Story, The Politics and Intrigue Behind Palestine's Untapped Gas Wealth, which was published last September, and which tells the story of Palestine's most valuable natural resource, gas field yet to be developed offshore the Gaza Strip.
Now, we are, of course, all going to go and buy your book. Those of you who are looking at this through YouTube will see that we do actually have a copy of it here. Would you be able to give us the synopsis of what is in your book?
So without giving away any spoilers, the book as I say, tells the story of the Gaza Marine field, really from the beginning, or even actually before the beginning. So the book opens in about 1993, when the Oslo Peace Accords were signed between the Palestinian Authority, or between Palestinian Liberation Organization and the Israeli government, and that led to the creation of the Palestinian Authority. At the time, it was meant to be a temporary 5-year arrangement until Palestinian statehood. 30 odd years later, we're still here. In 1999, the Palestinian Authority awarded a license to a consortium made up of BG Group, at the time the UK's third largest oil and gas company, and their Palestinian partner CCC. And in the book, really tells the story of the exploration, the discovery of that field, and the sometimes torturous negotiations to try and get that field developed. It is a commercially viable field. It is not technically difficult to develop. If it was at any other address in the world, it would have been developed by now. But the politics intervened in a big way. The day after the field was discovered, the Second Intifada erupted, violent protests across the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Have to say that is purely coincidental. The discovery of the gas field did not lead to a Second Intifada. And I wrote the book really for, I suppose, three main reasons. One, the main reason is that it does look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through a different lens. Less has been written about the business and economic side of the conflict. That was the main reason. Second, over the 25 or more years since the field was discovered, and through all these ups and downs, a lot of myths, misconceptions, conspiracy theories have grown up around the project and the story. And I wanted to try and cut through some of that. And one whole chapter is devoted to kind of dismissing or debunking some of those myths. And the third, I think, it's an intrinsically interesting story. It's by far the most interesting project I will ever work on. As I say, I think it's a side of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and story that deserves to be told.
So you've written this story at a very important time as well, because of course it's not as if the Middle East and the region in general is not in our news every single day. But before we delve into that, if we go all the way back to basics, so you mentioned that we don't just burn gas for energy, we also use gas for a whole load of other products. Can you give us a rundown into some of the other areas in which we actually use gas?
I suppose the next biggest use of gas after energy is to make fertilizers. So, which is, of course, very important for feeding the world. And indeed, in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia in particular, large fertilizer producer using their own gas for that. So, and yes, gas is a fossil fuel, and in this day and age, you have to be cognizant of that. And therefore, there are challenges about developing gas and using it, which minds better than mine can grapple with. But it does. The claim by many, especially gas supporters, is it's the cleaner or the cleanest of the fossil fuels, and many countries have large endowments of gas. They can use their gas and see it as a transition from where we are now, where we have been in a kind of fossil dominated energy system, to a more sustainable, renewable energy system. Because it can, as an energy source, it can act as a backup to solar and wind and other renewable sources.
And I guess just like some of the other non-renewable energy sources, it's very easy to transport it compared to some alternative forms of electricity, etc.
Gas, because of its inherent nature, is obviously more difficult to transport than oil. You can't just get it out of the ground and put it in a tanker and say, "Who wants to buy my oil?" So, and this is one of the things I highlight in the book, but is one of the kind of characteristics of any gas field or any gas producing country. You have to know where the market is at the end of the pipeline or at the end of a shipping lane. There are really only two ways to transport gas: either pipeline over relatively short distances, up to maybe a few hundred or low thousands of miles, or cool it to minus 162 degrees and put it in essentially a large floating thermos flask, LNG tanker, and ship it across the world, which is how a lot of the world's gas these days is transported. And because it's shipping, this is one of the impacts of the current conflict in the Gulf, because a lot of the world's gas comes from Qatar, which is locked at the moment behind the closed Strait of Hormuz.
So let's talk about the Middle East, because if we try and talk about other stuff, we're gonna ping back there like a piece of elastic. So in terms of what we can learn, I guess, with regards to the Gaza Marine story, and then its link across into what's going on more broadly at the moment,
Mhm.
what's your interpretation of what is happening right now?
Um, I think what comes out of my experience and the experience of the Gaza Marine story, it is an example of the importance of understanding the political situation you're getting yourself into. One of the in doing my research for the book, one of the things that became apparent talking to people who'd be involved in the project at the very early stages, is BG didn't really do its homework about what it was getting into. And obviously, it was aware of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It had a huge or a growing business next door in Egypt. It had acquired um, licenses offshore Israel in Israeli waters, and had this vague notion that it needed to show some sign of balance, and acquire Palestinian uh, interests as well. But it was clear that it hadn't done its proper due diligence and had a really thorough understanding of the political situation it is getting into. Um, Companies these days are more sophisticated than that. They will and should put a great deal of effort into understanding the politics of the situation they're getting into, building the right relationships in government and in society more generally, and being aware that the situation, as we have seen over the last few years, and even over the last 50, 60 years in the Middle East, situations don't remain static. Things change. Um, Political leaders change, alliances come and go, uprisings happen, uprisings are put down. Just society changes with technological developments, with cultural developments, opening up of countries, closing down of countries. So situations, especially in the Middle East, do not remain static. And I think companies, hopefully these days, are much better at understanding that and planning for it and building it into their processes, their risk management processes, their business processes.
So you mentioned that there was absolutely no causation, only correlation between the discovery of gas in a certain part of the world and various political and events that then took place very quickly afterwards. But again, just to reiterate the fact that there was not causation there, what do you feel the kind of the link is between the presence or the potential presence of natural resources and then the geopolitical sphere, which of course moves at a very, very different speed compared to those geological processes that have concentrated, be it oil, gas, minerals, metals, etc., within the ground?
So, although in the case of the Gaza Marine story, there wasn't causation, obviously around the world and in the Middle East, the existence of resources in one part has absolutely caused conflict or sparked conflict, whether that's competition over oil, gas, and I think increasingly in the Middle East, and it may be a factor in the current conflict in the Gulf, is other minerals. So obviously the Middle East is known as the kind of the world's provider of oil and to some extent gas, but there are other minerals there. Saudi Arabia mines copper and gold. Iran, the country at the center of the current storm, is full of minerals. It's underexplored, uh, uh, underexploited. Has a long tradition of mining, historically mining copper and other minerals. So I think that is an underlying factor in the current conflict. Not to say that US is deliberate, or other countries are deliberately trying to grab those minerals. But as competition for those minerals around the world increases, um, Iran is a potential source for possibly many decades to come. And where it sits as well, right at, between Europe and Asia, strategically, it's always been a very important country.
Yes, it's got a lot going for it, really, in terms of, from that natural, be it geographical positioning, be it the natural resources in the ground. But it almost feels like understanding the geology, and then from an engineering perspective, as you articulated, from a gas perspective, gas in itself is difficult to transport. But from an engineering perspective, we fixed it. You either kind of cool it a long way, or you build a pipeline. I guess it feels like the most difficult aspect of understanding natural resources is actually the human bit, because we're the ones that create immense complexity.
Indeed, and it's called political risk, and politics is all about the interaction or the power relationships between different groups of humans, at various levels. And in any of these big projects, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's in Iran, or whether it's in Saudi Arabia, or wherever, the politics is often the factor that can be a showstopper, can cause problems, and then not just the large ticket items like conflict or major uprising, for example, like you saw the Arab Spring, a few years ago, but also, just changes in government policy. If the government changes the taxation policy, if the government changes the fiscal terms, wants to reopen your contract for some reason, there is a change of attitude or approach to how it wants to manage its own natural resources. That can be as big a problem, as bigger showstopper for a company as something that hits the news headlines every day.
And it's not just the politics, I guess, that you're trying to understand. It's also the culture of those different countries that are involved, because what one person maybe thinks is right, somebody else maybe thinks is wrong. I mean, how do you navigate that?
So that is all about the social dynamics in the country, yes. And I think it's about so there will be government policy on, fiscal terms and tax, and maybe things like beneficiation, and all those sorts of factors. But there's also an importance to show, if you're exploiting, producing minerals, raw materials in the country, showing not only that you're doing it in the government's interest, because governments come and go. Sometimes they stay for a long time, but governments eventually come and go. But in the national interest, I think that's where companies can sometimes become unstuck, as they concentrate too much on, like, appeasing the government and meeting the government's objectives, and losing the bigger picture of what's in the overall national interest, and making the case, um, not just at the government level, but at a social, community level, about why it's important and beneficial to a country to exploit its gold or its copper or its gas or whatever minerals they happen to be. And that requires a much more maybe sophisticated and nuanced approach. And it's about not just showing that you are um, doing it by the letter of the law, um, but showing that you are acting responsibly, that you are not just paying your taxes, but you are having a social and economic beneficial impact on the country, whether it's creating jobs, whether it's sourcing goods and services in a country, and all those sorts of factors. So it's a much bigger picture, which reaches across, if like, almost all business processes, all parts of the business and the project.
So, so is there a playbook? Like, how do organizations, and I mean, at the moment, we're just talking about companies. We haven't mentioned state-owned companies or different types of entity. But yeah, I mean, is there a playbook? Are there frameworks? How do you know where to even begin?
There are some frameworks out there. There's starting with the Sustainable Development Goals, but also things like the IFC has its performance indicators. Uh, there are, and World Bank has some of the things. There are international standards and frameworks and initiatives to try and uh, ensure, companies and projects and resources are exploited in a responsible manner. But also, those can be quite high level. They can be, and they're meant to be applied globally. I think it's very important for any organization, whether it's a state-owned company or a private company, having a really thorough understanding of the actual situation it's involved in, looking at in the round in 360 degrees. So not just the politics, and not just the national politics, but the local politics and the international aspects as well, but also social movements, social trends, cultural differences. If you have a country or a situation like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where there is real tension, real hostility, real mistrust between two groups of people, that will have an impact. And you get that to a certain extent in many parts of the world where you have different ethnic groups or um, uh, uh, internal divisions for one reason or another. But it's also about the environmental aspects of it, and looking at looking in the round and making sure you take it all the what's often called the above ground factors, anything that is if you like not in the purview of the engineers.
So if we try and, I guess, make this real. So let's imagine we're going into an imaginary, or we're considering exploring or taking a proper look at a potential asset in an imaginary country. And so you've done your initial, I guess, assessment with regards to those above ground different factors or aspects. How do you then put them on the table inside those decision making rooms inside a company? So, firstly, who do you need around that table? And secondly, what are some of the hints and tips that you've got in terms of getting people to understand disciplines or different areas of potential threat and opportunity that might not come naturally to them?
So I think it does require, to use a horrible cliche, a multidisciplinary approach, or it needs most people around the table. I remember sitting around tables when I was at BG, and we would have so you would have the engineers in the room, you'd have the lawyers, you might have finance people, you would certainly have the commercial people, and maybe the exploration team, and it's looking at all those factors and how do you make it real for people. Um, One way is to really drill down and show, excuse the pun, show impacts. So um, some of the political risks, even the big ticket thing, the threat of conflict can seem so maybe even very low likelihood, but obviously would have a potentially high impact. What more down to more really, what would a change in a tax, what a 1% change in tax, for example, mean to the project, um, and what could prompt that. It's not as though the Minister of Tax is going to wake up one morning and just say, I want to raise taxes. There will be reasons for that. There might be a growing push, growing realization in the country is not getting it, or a perception, and perceptions matter in this area. Perception that the government or the country is not earning enough from its mineral resources, and therefore it becomes a head of steam to increase the tax rate or to do other changes to the fiscal regime, which bring more money, or would appear to bring more money in for the government. So it's really not just it's understanding the impacts and what may cause it. We know what is going to cause those impacts, and it's about something that's it could be done through scenarios. Things aren't going to stay the same. What could make things better? What could make things worse? What's likely to happen? What might happen? And the range of low to high probability and high impact events that and to really think as widely as possible, and think the unthinkable. You quite often you around these tables you can say, oh, that could never happen. There could never be a revolution in Egypt. And in fact, somebody very senior in an oil and gas company said that to me in the weeks after the Tunisian, because obviously the Arab Spring started in Tunisia. Weeks later, some say, oh, that'll never happen in Egypt. I said, are you sure? It could absolutely happen. It could absolutely happen in Egypt. The same set of circumstances, the same factors are at play there, and of course it did. There are numerous. If we go back to Iran, Nobody saw the Iranian Revolution coming in 1979. And in fact, a lot of people didn't see the current Iran conflict coming even weeks before it was it started, because the US and Iran seemed to be in talks and President Trump had made a big deal about not getting involved in forever wars and so forth.
Yeah.
Think the you have to think the unthinkable, and take it to extremes. Um, at the start of the Gaza conflict in 2023, I don't think anybody foresaw that it would go to the stage where 90% of Gaza was basically being flattened, and 2 million people are essentially um, been displaced, or almost 2 million people have been displaced. So you have to really think what is the what is the best that could happen, but also what is the absolute worst that could happen? How far could this go?
And in terms of almost trying to spark the imagination and, in a way, the courage to think those thoughts, when you're working with, say, engineers who, and I'm being very stereotypical here, there are many very imaginative engineers, but many engineers do like data. But now what we're doing is we're saying, well, what if the future holds X, Y, Z, where perhaps there isn't any data? How do you get people to think out that far outside of the box?
So there will be some data. There's probably some data, but you're working in situations where there's incomplete data. So you, in thinking these unthinkable thoughts, or thinking the worst case scenario, it's using analogies. So it's happened here, or it's happened before, so it could happen again. It may have happened, it may not happen in this part of the world, but it's similar situations in other parts of the world. There is also some quantitative data. You can talk economic data about the uh, if if the economy is getting worse, not growing sufficiently. You could see that in the Middle East. Population growth was outstripping economic growth, so there was eventually going to be a problem. Growth, energy demand in Egypt, for example, was growing higher than they could, than they could sustain. So there are data sets out there that you can use and extrapolate from, and it's not an engineering process. You don't put in the data at one end, you turn the cogs of the tail wheels, and you get the answer out the other end. It is more subjective. It does require some qualitative analysis at the same time. But so it's a mixture of some data sets, sometimes incomplete or not very satisfactory, and the qualitative analysis and the human analysis, which I think is the part that AI still can't quite do.
Well, no, AI still relies on information that's already gone in, doesn't it? Even though I guess there is some imagination perhaps beginning to come through there. But I guess with this as well, it's so dynamic. I mean, again, where things change in geology, it's typically because we get a new data set, or someone thinks, well, actually, no, I want to interpret an existing data set in a different way. The rocks generally don't change all that quickly. Whereas when we're talking about geopolitics and people, things can change by the second. So how do you keep up, let alone ahead?
I think things can seem to change very quickly. Events, can escalate, as we've seen in both the Gaza conflict and the Iran conflict. But a bit like geological time flows, the underlying trends and developments can be longer term. You can see longer term trends, whether it's population growth, whether it's economic growth, whether it's social and cultural changes in a country. We've seen over the past, I don't know, 20, 30 years, and that's short in geological time. For in political risk time, that's a long term. For Saudi Arabia slowly develop, and things open up, rather develop as an economy and open up, slowly opening up, sometimes likened to the kind of geological time is taken. But there are longer term trends. We've seen, for example, in Western Europe, long term trend of, for example, more women entering the workforce, or social changes. Socially becoming the Western Europe becoming socially more liberal, for example. You've seen long term trends in the Middle East of becoming socially less liberal, um, uh, especially since the 1979 Iranian Revolution and other events in 1979 in the Middle East. So you do see these longer term trends as well, and it's monitoring those, which give you again give you some data and give you some analogies and evidence for keeping abreast of developments, as well as the short term, if you like, news cycle as well.
So given the fact that there are some long-term trends that are there, so if you're then thinking, right, I want to be involved in some sort of raw material project, but I also want to make sure that the way in which we do it leaves that particular patch of land and society better off than when I first engaged with it. Are there are there criteria that you can kind of almost build? Like, what's your appetite for taking risk in certain areas, which then sort of say to you, well, there are certain patches of the world where no matter how good the rocks are or the environmental aspects or the local community, actually the geopolitical aspect on top of that just says, nah, I'm not going to go.
Well, I mean, certainly large parts of the Middle East, Iran, the Gulf have been, in terms of mining for hard minerals, not oil and gas, have been closed for a very long time, yeah, almost since oil was discovered in the region. But I think
So why is that?
because I think oil was discovered, and oil was easy.
Okay.
Essentially, oil was much easier than gas, or certainly much easier than gas, and oil was needed at the time. If you think in the aftermath, certainly kind of around before the lead up to the First World War, between the wars and then after the war, there was huge, insatiable demand for oil as the world kind of transitioned from coal and if you like steam power to oil. And it was easy, in some parts of the Middle East. Some parts of the Middle East, it was bubbling to the surface, but you just had to punch a hole, and there's oil. So I think that was and the rocks and the geology was less understood than it is now. So I think that was, despite the kind of long history of gold mining in Egypt or copper mining in Iraq. So oil was easy and was needed there and now. Now, if I think obviously that's changing, and the Middle East governments are very concerned about the long term prospects of oil, given everything, the climate crisis and the for the first time since the discovery of oil, governments are around the world are actively trying to suppress oil demand. Some governments are trying to actively suppress oil demand and to a lesser extent gas demand, and that is a long-term threat to the economies of Saudi Arabia, UAE, and the other some of the other Gulf states. And at the same time, the world is looking for more minerals, which the region does have. So I think there is a long-term trend to um, yeah, exploit those minerals as well. We've seen it in Egypt. Egypt, a few years ago, changed its mining law and mining and fiscal regime to encourage, with some success, to encourage new entrants uh, to the sector. So Saudi Arabia has a nascent mining industry. Other Gulf states, Oman and to a extent as well, and um, Iran. The long term trend is that eventually, Iran will become could become a center for a source of some of these minerals, and how it will actually get there will be a long and tortuous journey. But I think that is the longer term outlook, and a lot of the right factors are in there. Apart from the geology being right and minerals being there, um, it has a large population, it has a well educated population, it has a huge experience in engineering for the oil and gas sector. It sits across major trade routes. All the factors are in its favor, apart from maybe the geopolitics.
So what can companies, governments actually learn from this recent history of oil and gas in this region almost anticipating the fact that there will be a shift to, say, copper, for example, coming out the ground. Is there anything that we can proactively either put in place or prepare for to make sure we don't trigger some of the conflict, for example, that we're experiencing at the moment through the extraction of a natural resource that is sitting right there?
I think I would the big factor, I think, is more is collaboration and transparency. So the way the oil industry developed in the region, it was kind of kept very tight. It was very government dominated, um, and it wasn't really transparent about where the money was coming from, where the money was going to. And I think that in some countries that didn't matter as much, just because there was so much money. It could be spread around very easily, and you've seen the development of huge mega cities in the Middle East, Dubai, and these sorts of places, and essentially any discontent was essentially bought off by that. In some countries that won't be possible. We've seen it in Iraq, the bigger country, the bigger populations, Egypt, Iraq, Iran. That's not going to be possible. So I think it does require collaboration. I mean, collaboration within the country, between the private sector and the government within the country, rather than being very state dominated, um, uh, but also collaboration between countries. In terms of mining, these countries have a lot to learn from Australia, Indonesia, the big mining, well-developed mining economies, and a lot to learn from not just their governments, but the private sector companies as well. So collaboration between countries and between foreign investors and governments as well, I think is the big factor. Um, and before that, a bit more stability and peace, less conflict.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, do we think that those countries, for example, will be open to learning? But I guess they've got one or two things to fix first.
Yes, and the issue, one of the obviously factors of the conflict is they might not want to learn from Western Europe and North America. They will look to China or Indonesia or other countries, and that affects the geopolitics, and that affects the ability of companies to operate in there. If there is a preference for, say, Asian firms or South American firms rather than North American or Western European companies.
So, just in closing, I'm not going to ask you to put a time and a date on when the Straits of Hormuz will definitely open, because I don't know, that's either going to date this particular podcast recording, or I don't know, tempt fate or something like that. But in terms of, I guess, the future for the region as a whole, so you mentioned that there are some long term trends that we have here. Where do you see this potentially going? Pick your favorite scenario in terms of where the region as a whole is off to.
I think the region is shifting away from its traditional alliances with North America and Western Europe. You see, and at the same time becoming more fractured. So there will be essentially the Gulf states plus one or two other states, Egypt, Jordan, and so forth, were almost not quite united, but kept together and had very similar alliances with not with the United States, with the EU. That is fracturing. You see it in the kind of developing rivalry between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and at the same time, you see a drift away from. They realize they can't rely on the US or Europe, and Europe's distracted by the war in Ukraine anyway. Um, and you see stronger relations, not necessarily military at the moment, but stronger commercial, diplomatic relations being built with not just with China, but with Indonesia, with Pakistan, with other states and the blocks further east. Um, uh, you see UAE projection of power into East Africa, for example. So I think the region is moving towards being more fractured and so being less less easy to read in that sense, and drifting diplomatically at least and alliance wise, maybe slightly further east.
And so what does this mean for raw materials, be that oil, gas, minerals, metals?
I think that means they may become more available to the global market, but maybe it will be harder for North American and Western European firms to access those, and they might have to go the long way round through their Asian partners.
So, Michael, thank you very, very much. I'll be very interested to see what the future holds. If you haven't already done it, please everybody go and check out the Gaza Marine Story by Michael Barron, because it is a fantastic read and an intriguing story, if nothing else. So, Michael, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sarah.
So that was my conversation with Michael. And what I found particularly interesting is the distinction between trying to predict the future and trying to understand what might shape it. Throughout the discussion, we moved between Gaza, Iran, the Strait of Hormuz, and the wider geopolitical shifts taking place across the Middle East. These are obviously enormous and incredibly complex subjects, but Michael's point is that the events we eventually see in the headlines rarely exist in isolation. Behind them are often much slower moving trends, such as population growth, economic pressures, changing societal expectations, shifting alliances, changes in trade, and changing relationships between countries and regions. Individually, none of those tells us exactly what is going to happen, but taken together, they can tell us quite a lot about the direction in which things might be moving. And I think that's a really useful way of thinking about risk. It's tempting to judge geopolitical risk by what's happening today, but for natural resources in particular, that's rarely enough. The decisions we make can have consequences over decades. A gas field, a mine, an agricultural investment, an energy project, or a piece of infrastructure may operate through numerous governments, economic cycles, and changes in public expectations. So understanding the longer-term direction of travel matters. I also found Michael's discussion about the changing role of the Middle East particularly interesting. For multiple decades, the region's relationship with natural resources has been dominated by oil and gas, but that has the potential to change. Countries, including the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Oman, are looking more seriously at mining, while Iran has substantial mineral resources that remain comparatively underexplored and underdeveloped. At the same time, relationships within the region and between the Middle East, Europe, North America, and Asia are shifting. Michael suggests that we may see stronger commercial and diplomatic relationships looking eastwards, which could have significant implications for who develops those resources and ultimately who has access to them. There was another point Michael made that I thought was really important. Understanding political risk isn't simply about understanding governments, because governments change. You also need to understand the country, its culture, its communities, its economic circumstances, its history, and whether the development of a particular resource can genuinely be seen as being in the wider national interest, rather than simply meeting the priorities of whichever government happens to be in power at the time. That feels particularly relevant to responsible raw materials, whether we're talking about gas, copper, food, energy, or any of the other natural resources. The technical case is only one part of the decision. We also need to understand the place, the people, and the wider context in which that resource sits. And perhaps the simplest thing I'll take from Michael's interview is this: we don't need to predict tomorrow's headlines, but we should probably get better at recognizing the trends that might eventually create them. Thank you so much to Michael for joining me, and thank you for listening. Responsible Raw Materials brings together voices from across industry, academia, government, civil society, and beyond. These conversations include all aspects of raw materials, including minerals and metals, recycling and reuse, agriculture, forestry, fishing, energy, environment, infrastructure, and society, in each case exploring shared challenges as well as opportunities. We try to create the space for honest and open discussion, as it's through listening to and engaging with one another's true perspectives that new ideas can form and improvements made. To find out more and explore hundreds of videos, resources and links, all freely accessible, please go to www.responsiblerawmaterials.com.